morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of Mourning in the Morning. Thank you for those of us who are joining us from home or first time streaming on these programs. I'm Brandt with the local history genealogy division here at the Rochester Public Library. Always your host for these programs. Today we have the pleasure of having Chris Brandt from Berkeley Architecture speak on Leander McCord Jr., Rochester's architect of the 20s. We're happy to list a familiar name in Rochester's architectural history and his impact on the city's housing stock, in particular his notable and worthy of a lot more discussion. Looking forward to hear what Chris has to say about it.
Thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you for everyone who's tuning in from home. So I just want to start with a little bit of backstory about why I'm interested in Leander McCord. I've been interested in Leander McCord for about 12 years now. This is the first time I've given a talk on him in almost 10 years. So it's great to sort of revisit my sort of first research passion. I'm a historic preservation architect professionally, so I work on.
Take your break.
I take a mask off? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm a historic preservation architect here in Rochester, so I work on historic homes and buildings throughout the city and beyond professionally. And what led me to that sort of niche profession has a lot to do with some of the early mentors I had in high school, like Cynthia the Language Society. But it also, I think, has a lot to do with where I grew up, or at least spent my sort of formative years as a teenager, and that was in a Leander McCord design house. This is a historic photo of the house. My parents still live there today. And it's a really good example of his work. Has a lot of his sort of design signatures about it, and I think living and experiencing that space sort of day to day definitely had me and inspired me to pursue architecture as a career instead of other interests that I might have had at that time. And the way we found out about the house being designed by Leander McCord is because we went on a home garden tour with the Language Society, I think back in 2005, 2006, and we saw this house. Which at that time was one of maybe only 4 or 5 known houses designed by McCord. And the stonework, as well as the design of the sort of distinctive, prominent 3-tiered chimney, looked oddly familiar to me. And I wondered if perhaps the architect that designed this house, maybe designed the house that we were looking at. Through some research, confirmed that estimate, and then that sort of set off a very prolonged and sort of obsessive research desire to learn more about this person who designed these houses. So I'll give you a little bit of biographical of Leander. So he was the fourth of 5 children of Leander Sr. and Laura Hills McCord. A lot of his family came from the Albion or the Orleans County area. And initially he had started in farming, but he actually had both his father and his grandfather were well-known carriage makers, both in Albion and then once the family moved to Rochester just a few years before Leander's birth. He went to our first municipal high school, Rochester Free Academy, downtown Rochester, and then went on to study architecture at what is now RIT, when they used to have it down on campus here. And then spent a little bit of time at Columbia University, and it's always claimed that he studied at the famous French architecture school, the Ecole Art, but there really is not a lot of documentation to substantiate that. Though he did travel to Europe a number of times. So these were a couple of business cards of his father's business, Leander McCord Sr. So he was well known both as a carriage designer and manufacturer as well as a carriage dealer. And Leander's older brother George actually carried on the family business and transitioned the business into early truck and automobile manufacturing in Rochester before he sort of retired from the business. This is a picture of Easton Hall at the Kansas Institute, now known as RIT in downtown. Easton Hall was where the architecture school under RIT was located. And this is a picture of what that architecture school looked like. This is about 15 to 20 years after McCord had studied at RIT, but this setup would have been very similar as far as having these sort of broad open studios and multiple drafting desks and well lit or natural light pouring in. And then this is the building that he studied briefly at Columbia. And the Columbia School of Architecture was one of the earliest schools of architecture in the United States, but was relatively small, so it only occupied the fourth story in that building you see. So when he started his professional career, he spent about 1 year, a little bit more, working for Charles Crandall. Crandall at that time was doing a lot of work in firehouses as well as Peace and Kodak Company. But really, his primary sort of mentor, professional mentor, was J. Foster Warner. He worked at J. Foster Warner's office for 8 years, before breaking out on his own very briefly, and then partnering with a former colleague, Frederick Ives, in 1911. And then, of course, we have his service in World War I, where he served functional educational capacity, so he utilized his architecture school to work on the design of hospitals for the War Department, but also served in the U.S. Cavalry. So a few buildings that he was listed as a contributing designer or team member for under J. Foster Warner was the original East High School on Alexander Street, West High School, which we now know as Wilson Magnet over on Dundee, as well as the George Easton House. So not a bad number of projects to be working on as a young designer and fledgling architect. So I'm going to show you some examples of this sort of early partnership. So it lasted for about 7 or 8 years. There are a few buildings that were built after the partnership breaks up, I think largely due to delays from World War I, but most of them would have been sort of designed in those sort of 6 to 7 years before the U.S. entered World War I. So, like I mentioned before, they were both former draftsmen of J. Foster Warner's office. Frederick was about 14 years older than Leander. I got a nickname there, Lee, which was a recent discovery. But so he was Lee's 14. He was Lee's senior by 14 years. So I think in large part he had served primarily to make sure that the business was operating and being successful. You'll see there's a sort of continuity of design language that starts here with this partnership, but then continues on with Leander being on his own. So I think largely a lot of the projects you see under McCord and Ives, McCord would have been the chief designer of the partnership. So they did a handful of different public works, including a public high school that originally was designed for the Gates School District, but after city annexation became a public city school, now known as School Number 44, the Lincoln Park School. And then there were a handful of fire departments, and something that plays into indicating McCord being the chief designer is one of the 3 fire departments was actually designed and completed under McCord when he split off from Ives. The first one there on your left, so that's now O's 22 restaurant. It was left abandoned for a number of years. It has been sort of lovingly rehabilitated, converted into a restaurant up in Charlotte. And then this is a former fire department on Westridge Road near Kodak Park. And then there's also another one on Parcells Avenue in the Beechwood neighborhood. And there's a little sort of close-up of the sort of intricate pattern brickwork. And something also sort of drawing out to you sort of start to see over and over again is sort of McCord's language of using very balanced, classically inspired proportions. So his buildings don't sort of feel very wide or very tall. They just sort of have a very sort of substantial presence to them. It's sort of they carry through throughout his sort of career of design. The Dundee Village Library, this is one of the very last designs of the partnership. And it's the only library I'm aware of that he had a hand in designing, and still sort of wonderfully preserved and still utilized as a public library today. And here's a Tudor Residences, which we'll sort of see, when we begin to see this design language, you're going to see this repeated as McCord then breaks out on its own. One of the earlier, more substantial residences was named for Hattie Robinson. She was the owner of her own business here in Rochester, was very successful, and contracted McCord and I to design this sort of very distinctive Tudor Revival design. Was a little atypical, I would say, once you start seeing more McCord's work, is this very interesting use of Flemish bonded brick with 2 different colors of brick. You're not going to really see that again, but what you will see are these sort of very highly articulated entryways, and then this use of sort of decorative shutters, as well as often these sort of small decorative windows, probably looking into the bathroom with a coordinated flower box beneath. You might also see this sort of composition of this dormer with a segmental arch window and pedimented rooftop. You might see that sort of over and over and over and over and over again. So he sort of developed a kit of parts all in a way through his career that he utilizes to design his various residences. And what's sort of really fun is seeing two different houses designed for two different clients around the same period of time, utilizing this same sort of very high style entrance, but obviously with some sort of different cladding materials, but the houses are sort of largely the same. You see this again and again in his career, where you have these sort of clones or near clones, and I'll sort of touch on these ideas sort of in doing sort of iterations of a design and how he develops and modifies that for different clients. This is another early one. Frederick Sage was a prominent builder at the time that McCord and I had worked with. This is one of their earliest projects that was designed by McCord. It's in the Browncroft neighborhood. Browncroft neighborhood has a number of McCord design homes. This is probably the earliest one in the neighborhood. And you'll sort of notice, although this, obviously this entrance is way different than what we just saw, some of the same compositional elements that we're seeing are this notion of having these sort of playful either trellises or privacy screens on the sides of the entries. And then you start to see far more predominantly these sort of very daintily proportioned roofs, especially as culinary bottom is almost impossibly thin, but have held up over time. And then this is just a smattering of the firm's work throughout the city. This is another house in the Browncroft neighborhood. These are a number of houses in the sort of Park Avenue, Upper Monroe neighborhood. You can again see some similar design language. We have this really sort of highly articulated decorative window with that integrated flower box. We see these sort of decorative trellis work used in multiple different locations. You'll sort of see this sort of composition repeated and iterated over and over again with a number of his Tudor Revival designs. There's that same dormer design we saw earlier, and then these sort of very sort of beautiful, delicate sort of privacy screens inserted into the entryways to the homes. So like I mentioned, so he had worked for the War Department initially during World War I on their sort of crew of architects and designers that were designing these temporary hospitals, both in the United States as well as over in Europe. And then he also had a stint of service working serving with the U.S. Cavalry. Unfortunately, not a lot of details on that yet. I hope to find out more, maybe actually identify what specific troop he worked for. So none of these photos are showing specifically things he worked on, giving you an idea of what he worked on. So that's not like, it'd be great if it was like him. Okay, so he returns back to Rochester after his service in World War I. His partnership with Fred Ives has sort of dissolved. Fred Ives enters into civic service and was a sort of code enforcement official and city architect for a while, but really Mr. Ives doesn't really get hardly any coverage or documentation of any work that he was doing after he split off from McCord, sort of passes away with a very small obituary that doesn't even mention he's an architect when he dies in 1941. The same is not true for Mr. McCord. So there are only two photos of McCord. This is Leander or Lee in 1922 when he applies for his passport to travel over to Europe, specifically focusing on multiple locations in England as well as traveling over to France. He travels over to Europe at least twice, and he often goes with a close friend of his, Chauncey Woodward, who they had grown up together in Rochester, and Chauncey became very successful in finance and banking and moves to Palm Beach. So there's also a lot of frequent trips to Palm Beach during the 1920s, late 1920s, and recounts of McCord and his friends sort of sitting on the beach in Florida. So he certainly strikes me as a prototypical sort of bachelor of the sort of roaring 20s, really sort of living it up in a way. But he has a very sort of sharp rise to fame. Within a few years, he's designing multiple homes per year, doing design of whole neighborhoods, getting a large amount of coverage in the local newspapers. And that's actually what sort of made my project researching him a lot easier, is that there was so much documentation about him because he was so well covered. But unfortunately, largely because once we get to the Great Depression, and money begins to fly. This practice really starts to slow down by the mid-1930s, and the coverage of his projects really diminishes, which I think either part to him just slowing down, but also part he definitely was very much a traditionalist in his designs, with the emergence and interest of modernism, especially starting around World War II and afterwards. I think that really sort of diminishes his appeal to commercial clients. It really has this sort of immensely prolific 10 to 15 years of work. Oh, sorry, where we dropped out there. And essentially everything you see, unless I mention it otherwise, is in that 10 to 15 years of work. There are well over 200 buildings during that 15-year period. I'm not going to show all 200. So I apologize for any of the McCord homeowners out there. Just a quick show of hands. How many people own McCord houses? Wow. A lot. Great. So my postcards work. So I apologize if your house is not in the presentation. I made a big effort over the last couple of weeks to photograph well over 100 of the houses. So I may have photographs of your house that just may not be in the presentation. Okay, so before we get to the meat of it, obviously his practice was primarily the design of single-family homes, but he did also design a number of other different types of buildings, but not in the sheer volumes that he was designing residential structures. One of my favorites, what we now know as the Rochester Contemporary Arts Center, what was known as the Master Building in 1824, was this sort of classically inspired, almost sort of French design storefront. I still need to bug Cynthia out, but she's got an old photograph that confirms that what you see here in the rendering, where we have this almost like French underground, Art Nouveau, wrought iron railings all over the place. Those were actually built, and they were on the building, but they're long since gone. So, but a lot of the stonework is still there. You can also notice this, the overall proportion is almost like a sort of a perfect square. Since there's substantial sort of proportion to the design, you can almost see, you know, those earlier firehouses that we were saying. It's sort of that same sort of interest, these guiding sort of proportions that he starts with before he sort of gets into the details of his various designs. And then I've always sort of found this sort of cute. In more recent research, I was able to figure out that the building right next door was actually designed by McCord back in 1916, which I think is why, when you look at the rendering, you know, there's not a lot of detail here on Hotel Sagamore, there's not a lot of detail here in Christ Church, but there is a fair amount of detail, nice detail in the cornice there on the adjacent building because, well, McCord designed it, so why not have a little more detail there in the rendering? He designed a handful of movie theaters throughout Rochester. Unfortunately, the only one that still stands is the Rexy Theater in South Avenue. This is technically a renovation of an earlier movie theater, but was a very substantial renovation. So a whole new facade, giant large addition, extension of the theater itself. So really, it was almost a sort of ground up new build. But the other theaters that he designed on Driving Park Avenue, as well as Webster Avenue, which were new builds, both those unfortunately are now vacant lots. But with a lot of his commercial buildings, you certainly see focus on sort of more tried and true classical design language, but also the sort of interest in these the intricate decorative details which we do see carried over to his residential designs. But certainly when we get to the residences, you're going to see a marked break as far as what his chief sort of design language is, which I'm sure a number of homeowners, given the majority of what his residences look like, I'm guessing you don't live in a classically inspired house. He designed a number of automobile structures, car dealerships, a handful of them still stand. This building actually does still stand, but it is heavily modified from what it is, but it has this sort of Spanish mission style to it. And we see sort of some similar forms we saw on the fire stations with this sort of second-story arcaded window here with the decorative columns, and then a lot of decorative wrought ironwork, which we see frequently in a lot of his work, including in his residential designs. And then perhaps his largest and most significant automobile structure was the sort of Wrangling, the Alliance or Pipe Motor Company building, which a lot of us know better as Sticky Lips. And again, even though this is a very sort of pared back, very sort of simple, flat facade, there is still these little flourishes of these decorative, intricate sort of geometric detailing here on the terracotta around each entrance to the building. So he also did a number of apartment buildings, as well as a handful of industrial buildings. Perhaps his most significant multi-unit apartment building is the Berkeley Department. It's still standing at Berkeley Street. And this is also where McCord lived for a large part of his professional career. He had a good relationship with the contractor that built this house, Joseph Jorah Slow. And Joseph Jorah Slow had McCord design a house for him as well as other apartment buildings. This is by far the sort of largest, most prominent building that he did. But McCord lived in Cottage Number 15 at Berkeley Department from the day it opened until about 5 years before his death. And then a handful of different factory buildings he worked on, but one of my favorites he did for the Connolly Company. This was a printing company, but just by virtue of what it is, it's a very simple design, but we do still have some of this sort of dental cornice and brick, which recalls some of those geometric forms we saw on the firehouses, and then little flourishes, sort of high school detail on those entry hoods, which there are several on the building. Then he also did, for the Crane Plumbing Company, they had a number of showrooms and warehouses throughout the United States, and one of the ones they had was here in Rochester. So McCord designed the building as well as the interior. Apparently the showroom was quite elaborate. And what's also sort of interesting, since I grew up in a courthouse, I've been in a number of courthouses, a lot of the original plumbing fixtures are Crane plumbing fixtures, which is maybe not a coincidence that he designed their local warehouse and showroom for them. And then one of the larger factory complexes, and this is still standing today, although it was built in phases. McCord was mainly involved in the phases of the factory that were built in the 1920s and the 1930s for the Key Locks Company, predominantly known for doing typewriter reels as well as carbon paper. And that factory complex is still standing over in the Marist Heights neighborhood. Okay, so now what you all came here for. There's a lot, so buckle up. So to start, I'm going to do my best to point these out as we go, but I hope that this is sort of a repetition of seeing these houses. You're going to start to see the consistency of the language, but to just run through verbally first. So I've already sort of touched on, we have these sort of balanced, classically scaled proportions. The buildings themselves predominantly are not classically inspired as far as their design details, but the proportions themselves have a very sort of grounded nature to them. We're going to see a lot of use of graduated symmetrical fenestrations. What I mean by that is windows and doors, and often you're going to have much broader openings at the first floor. And they graduate up to make ones on the second floor, it's a little bit skinnier, and they get up to a single window on the third floor of the attic. And some of them are done so well you can actually draw a line from first floor to attic, and that line will touch the corner of each of the window openings. And then I sort of fancy enfilade spatial sequences, so to sort of make it a little simpler, not be full architecture jargon on you, is he had a lot of these sort of axial lining up of various rooms, and you would sort of proceed through, and this idea of creating sort of threshold space that you proceed between. So as an example, with my parents' house, you have an approach to the house that has a terrace. You walk up, there's stairs that interrupt you halfway up, and you come to this sort of very intimate and sort of nearly private front porch that's nearly only big enough for 2 chairs, and then you enter into the vestibule if you're allowed in. The door is largely solid. But once you enter in, then you have a full lighted glass window allowing vista in, but still keeping you, then you proceed out into that, the sort of main foyer. Once you're in the foyer, if you were to turn 90 degrees, you have this other sequence of rooms that runs dining room, foyer, living room, and then sunroom, that you get this aligned axial vista all the way through the house. And so with a lot of his designs, he'd like to try to do that. Certainly some of the lots that the houses are built on don't allow that, but you'll still see these sort of constructed visual vistas, at least between 2 rooms, but you can. You'll try to align all of your public rooms in a line and create these sort of framed openings, often just open archways, because you don't want to have doors that close off that vista, and then terminating it at a broad expanse of glass, usually looking out to the exterior. And then, so I mentioned that the use of intimate alcoves and threshold spaces are also playing with scale, so especially with a lot of those grander homes. You'll see these very sort of small, one of my favorite houses, which I'll show a couple of interior photographs of, has this very small little reading nook that has little built-in bookcases off of this massive living room. And then doing the same thing again when you proceed to the kitchen, there's a sort of wider than normal butler's pantry. That's to allow for a breakfast nook. And sort of off to the side to sort of separate you from the dining room sort of servant space of the kitchen, but again, creating this sort of intimate scaled space between the two larger spaces. On Tudor Revivals, we touched on this before with the very first images of the House of Grosvenor as well as the House of sort of introduced me to the core, but the use of sort of three-part tiered chimneys. You can see a lot, as well as a lot of use of multi-tone rubble stone, often a mix of sandstone, granite, and limestone. We'll see that over and over. And then I mentioned on some of the McCord knives, the Tudor Revivals, we have very delicately composed entry porches that have these almost impossibly thin roofs. And then with many of the styles, the decorative floors that you'll see a lot of are predominantly use of wood turnings or timber brackets. And he calls these out in his drawings and designs the profiles of them, as well as use of the decorative trellis work, those window boxes, as well as ornamental windows. We'll see them in attics. We'll see them as sort of little flourishes on the second story of the house that are either round, triangular. They might be sort of like a little rose window. And then a lot of use of sort of Spanish-inspired wrought iron work, or we have sort of more English-leaning wood carvings that we'll see in a lot of the Tudor Revivals. Okay. So, just to use House of Grosvenor as an example, although this is not, some parts of it are not necessarily typical, but, so we have the sort of mixed rubble stone that's used sort of throughout. It's a little hard to see, but the chimney has a sort of full stone base that steps up to a stone and stucco midsection, and then a full brick upper section. So a three-tiered chimney. On the main gable here, we have a symmetrical graduated fenestration. You can almost draw a line from corner to corner. And he does it again also, you'll see these sort of symmetrical arrangements within overall asymmetrical design. There's got a decorative, oops. Do it. All right. There's one of those decorative windows. This little triangle window, but also this little Tudor arch window. There's also a circular porthole window on the back side of this house. We also have these sort of wood turnings you can see here at the front porch that are used as porch columns. We also see them as sort of decorative elements on like corners of window bays. They'll be used as sort of privacy screens over windows, or even really teeny tiny turnings I've seen that are like thrown in the corners of dormers. Okay, so something I started to key in on recently, just sort of making this presentation, is there is a little bit of a difference between his really early work before he goes to Europe, and then after that, when he's starting to get really prolific. In a way, I feel like this designs after NP22 become a little more whimsical, a little more playful, and these very early projects are a little bit more formal and by the book. So possibly his earliest Tudor Revival design, because oddly, he didn't design any Tudor Revivals that I could find when he was in partnership with Fred Ives. Is this house, the Tremont Residence? And we'll see, this is actually a design that McCord works on again and again and iterates different versions of it. But this is sort of the first version. But it is certainly a bit more formal, but we're still seeing some of what we're going to see in a lot of the other houses. It's use of heavy timber brackets and multiple different scales. There's some wood turnings here on the mullions between the windows. The windows are graduated, though not quite the same, but pretty similar. And then you can also see sort of these heavy timber brackets here on the porch. And then he also does like to use it with a simpler design like this. You'll have these sort of chamfered columns you see on the square columns. And then out of frame is a graduated chimney, which, there we go, 3 tiers. And this one, since it's for sale, has a few interior photographs. Treat you that I don't have a lot of interior photographs. I think that can be a whole different class. But I want to only show you exteriors. Here's a little close-up. So there's that sort of more English-inspired carved detail. You'll see. So I think this is the only carved flourish on this particular house. But you'll see other houses to see used a lot. And also, you can spy. See the front door there in the background? There's these tiny little turnings, these little turn spindles that are used to divide the glass of the door, and you see that as well. And again, that's a sort of fascination with these sort of turned wood elements to imply the sort of hand of craftsman at work on the house. These are some of the interiors. One of them sort of creating this sort of frame of view with this segmental arch, and then looking back out, so you can see that sort of sort of separation with a more private door with those turned spindles. Then we have open, those still sort of separate vestibule wall of letting glass leading you in, and then with your turn, once you got in, you can see we're sort of opening up either side. And then in the dining room here, he often, as best as he can, he's going to try to work in multiple little built-ins. You'll see in the dining rooms, you'll see a window seat in the living room. But again, there's this sort of playful, adding this little flourish of the little sort of smaller scale elements, but then also these sort of broad expanses of glass to allow you to look out. In some cases, you'll actually have the glass that go to the floor. Also, my parents' house, their dining room, they have lighting glass that goes from here down to the ground. And there's a door you can open, which is a little odd for a dining room. Another early one that same year, the Eaton Residence, but very similar to what we saw before. A lot of similar design language to that first house. And again, it's sort of more formal, less whimsical. And then this is also in the Brown Park neighborhood. This is maybe the earliest purely McCord house in Brown Park. And this one is almost like, in my eyes, it's sort of a colonial revival with Tudor decorative elements, because we have this symmetrical center entrance. The vast majority of McCord's Tudors are always going to be asymmetrical. They're not going to have that sort of center entrance balanced approach, but we still have sort of graduated fenestration. This interest in essentially using flower boxes wherever you possibly can to create some visual interest in dining the facade. It's a little bit of the sort of decorative screen, but now it's done in these little wood turns. But still, I think a little more rigid than what we're going to see once he comes back from Europe. Okay, so like I said, there are a lot of courthouses. So I chose two neighborhoods that have at least 10 to 12 houses in them, maybe more. I'm going to show you some houses from them, and I'm also going to show you some of the designs I mentioned that he does iterations on. So if you're not in the Maplewood neighborhood in the city, and you're not in the Cobb-Solar-Swartmar neighborhood in Brighton, you may or may not see your house, but we'll see. Okay. This is the first one in Maplewood, the Eaton Residence, and this one still has a little bit more of that sort of formal half timbering, but it's getting a little more playful with these sort of faux pegs, these sort of wavy edges. Now we're getting that rubble stone inserted in. The whole composition is far more sort of complex and experimental, playful with these bumped out pegs. Again, we have that graduated fenestration. They have a little flower box thrown in and a beautiful little hood, heavy timber brackets above that. This was his first project that was nationally published in the magazine Architecture by Scribner and Sons in 1923. And then just down the street from that, he continues to work in the Tudor Revival style. Just on the other frame, we do have this little sort of bumped up basically for a breakfast nook that has these sort of decorative brackets. You might actually assume to see more on his Tudor Revivals. Then we have that same sort of very formal entrance, very thin roof, and then that sort of decorative window with a more sort of decorative and elaborate flower box above. And most of these are actually in Seneca Parkway, so I'm just walking down Seneca Parkway showing you. And I'm not showing you every single one. There are a lot. And so just another example here. You're going to see a lot of the similar language. You also sometimes see, so this is maybe a little atypical, but I have seen this on a number of his students where I would almost consider this more of a Tudor Revival entry. We have that sort of semi-lunette window, that sort of classic little almost spider web design. But you do see that sort of used maybe in response to a client that wanted a little bit more formality and didn't necessarily want the standard McCord treatment with more heavy wood door with those wood turnings, and wanted something that was playing to some of the more classical design pieces. This is a house that we'll see different iterations of. I've, at least for now, coined it Rambler number 2 as far as a building type, and we'll see 3 or 4 different versions of this house. So keep it in your head, we'll revisit it. But still, a lot of the exact same stuff that we're seeing over and over again. The graduated fenestration, that's sort of symmetrically arranged in this main gable. Heavy timber brackets, both these sort of freestanding ones as well as the ones that are engaged with the wall, to sort of emphasize that termination between wall and roof. The flower boxes, I really love this sort of quaint little entrance and then these decorative windows thrown in for fun. probably to light either, I've seen them light both closets as well as bathrooms. I believe my parents' house has a window in almost every closet. Probably not good for clothing preservation, but it is still really cute to have a little nice window in your closet. And then you do see a couple of these, which I think are rather fun. So this is, to me, it's like a Tudor Revival, but it's all clad in like Tudor Revival detailing. So it's more classical entryway with this decorative oval window, and then this sort of all pure wood siding, very odd sort of board and batten siding, very typical for this era. And then you see this sometimes, this sort of fascination with geometry creates these sort of octagonal sunrooms. You'll sort of see that happen on a number of his houses. Again, as it's sort of playing with these sort of kit parts that he's developing. The previous owner of this house sent me drawings, otherwise I would not have known that this was McCord. But once I knew it, started looking at it a little bit more, it started to remind me of some of his other designs, especially having those sort of decorative trellises there as part of the entry. And then another great sort of Tudor Revival. It's a little hard to see, but when he does sort of open side porch, often you get sort of beautiful archways, and then the sort of decorative columns often inserted along the long side of the porch. And then this is another house that we'll see that he does more iterations of. It's like 4, 5, or 6 versions of this house throughout the Rochester region. It's on the Struckmark Hobsville. So this may look a little familiar, might look a little similar to my parents' house, and that's because this is another one that we're going to go through. We'll see those iterations. I might call this the sort of like fanciest version of it, but you'll sort of see how he plays with different cladding materials, and also often with these houses that he does iterations on, the front facade might almost look like a clone, but often the house gets sort of changed or tailored to the client, and often the back sides of the house differ. So maybe the rear wing might be a different position, may not have a rear wing at all. There'll be a different window arrangement on the back, but often the sort of fronts give you that instant visual. You're like, oh, I know where that, I know where the clone is of that house. It's over on this street. And then so these are number ones throughout Struckmar and the Cottage Number on various side streets. And you can see a lot of the similar design language, but this is going to be a little more playful with sort of bell-shaped roofs and the Georgian head gables. You still have the little engaged brackets, brackets around the entry door, and then the sort of symmetry within asymmetry as far as how he's composing his fenestration. Another one of those Tudor Revival clad and Tudor Revival details. Really great decorative gun window. And then the only ones I can find, he dabbles a little bit in working in that sort of design language, sort of Spanish or Mediterranean revival, which initially we were only sort of seeing on his sort of automotive work. But he does do a handful of Mediterranean revival style homes, and all of them appear to strictly be in the Struckmar neighborhood. So they're a little bit rare. So if you own this house or the other Mediterranean revival I'm going to show, you have a very special McCord house. But you can still see a lot of the very similar proportions that we're used to seeing. I really love this decorative window here at the second floor. And we also have this graduated 3-tiered chimney. And I'll let you with that not wintertime. Again, this gable is also similarly arranged. Really love multi-tone tile. Again, with these sort of Spanish Mediterranean revival homes, this is sort of the only instance that I've come across that he uses these. But what you do see again and again sometimes is I can't imagine this is great for water tightness. You can see how this roof doesn't quite turn into the wall. Yeah, so there's a built-in flower box there. Again, it's sort of notion we want to always sort of add this sort of little bit of visual interest of these windows and sort of make the home feel sort of more tied to the landscape. You see that a lot. I've seen some both Tudors as well as Mediterranean revivals occasionally on the Tudor Revival styles, but it's often this setup where you have a bump out more often than not for the dining room, and its little roof is sort of pushed out a little bit so it doesn't quite terminate, and then he plops the flower box on top of it just for fun. So I'm sorry that just around the corner from that. This is a really sort of great example showing a lot of what we're sort of used to seeing. There's this sort of graduate penetration with a little bump out dining room bay. the side gable, and then we also have the same thing on the front gable, and then this sort of great little single-story porch. It's actually a little maybe unique with McCord. Is often Tudor Revivals just generally don't have front porches. Given the era that Tudor Revival became very popular, you saw a de-emphasis of the front porch as being a component of residential design. So a lot of Tudor Revivals that you see won't have a front porch. They might have just a patio, potentially a back porch, but really it's not common to see a front porch in a Tudor Revival, but you actually see it pretty commonly, at least within McCord's work. Because when the sort of inspiration that they're pulling from the Tudor era of England, you see through Tudor era buildings in England, they don't have a front porch. It's sort of constant. The front porch is not part of that sort of building tradition during the sort of medieval era in England. And so pulling from that, obviously they're trying to, most people are trying to stay more true to style. But I like the sort of playfulness and the desire to have that connection to the exterior with McCord and adding those sort of porches as part of his compositions. This is another one of those sort of rare Spanish designs, again, similar three-tiered chimney, but it has this really wonderful decorative cap that has large brick openings with tile roof. And then these great dining room window doors that go all the way to the ground. And then an entry there, so we have these sort of decorative, highly sort of geometric flourishes there, and then here we go, there's the little turnings on that window, and even tinier on the front door. This is one of my favorites. Also in the area was a little bit on the edge of concrete, but again, a lot of similarities overseeing. There's that funky little flower box on top of the dining room bay. This has this very sort of prominent front-facing sunroom, which allows these great sort of vistas out to the sides and beyond, and it creates this sort of access through the house as the dining room exits onto the rear patio with a pair of bloody glass French doors. So this is a continuous view and connection between, in this case, rear side and front yard through that portion of the house. But again, very similar composition with the windows, the brackets. We go to the front. There's that same overall arrangement. Here's where, we've seen the turnings on bay windows. I think because a lot of houses we've seen so far, a lot of the bay windows on the back, you weren't seeing this, but this is very common, seeing these sort of what I call medium-sized turnings instead of the really big ones because on porches uses sort of decorative element on the window bay. And then a really great sort of arched front door with a little decorative flourish, and then again, these little hard to see, but these turned spindles there at the window. Okay, so in addition to doing single homes or multiple single homes throughout a neighborhood, he also did what I call planned developments, and these come in different scales and sizes. The biggest by far is he did a whole neighborhood up in Charlotte of very modest homes, but then there also are a series of smaller collections between 5 and 8 homes that he did in partnership with a single developer for each one. We'll go through all those. So this started literally right as he sort of kicks off his private career. He does this really wonderful rendering of the neighborhood, Lakedale. If you buy a home building corporation, McCord works with this sort of funneling name corporation frequently, sort of early in the 1920s. This is not the only project he works on, but it's by far the most cohesive and largest one that he does with buy a home. And you can sort of, a little modest home that has sort of very distinctive little front porch, but it's sort of bumped down to the side of the house, and that's actually the main entrance. You enter onto the porch and then turn and walk up into the house. You can sort of get that cast in either sort of Dutch colonial or Tudor Revival style. There's also a little more sort of straightforward colonial Revival style. The neighborhood is still there today, so it's lined with all these cute little houses. I got the opportunity to write up this house for City newspaper about 6 or 7 years ago. And you can sort of, when you walk in, you can still see how the porch was fully open. And what's really great about this that I love, so I didn't get written confirmation this is the case, but it's hard to deny. Anyone want to guess what the name of this street's called? Leander Road. So we got a street name back. And then this is not Leander Road, this is Cherry Road in the same neighborhood heading up to Lake Avenue. Again, all these sort of cute little houses marching along in a couple different styles. Again, not for the rich and famous, modest homes, but sort of modest quality design homes, and having the opportunity to design a whole neighborhood, sort of a rare opportunity for him. So the next three I'm going to show you are smaller collections. So the first one that he does, and this one's a little bit interesting in the design of the overall site. I've given them all little tongue-in-cheek names, so you can think related. I call this Maplewood Drive 5. So this is on Maplewood Drive in the Maplewood neighborhoods, overlooking the northern end of Maplewood Park, where there's a pond and a large jungle gym. And originally there was an apple orchard that they comment on in the advertisements for this development. And he designs 5 sort of distinctly different houses. They're all arranged along one another, and there's a hidden alleyway that runs behind the houses, so there's no driveway to interrupt a continuous lawn with all 5 houses, and each house has a sort of winding brick path to it, sort of create this little sort of idyllic oasis overlooking the park. There it is today, and here are all 5 houses. Does that one look familiar? So we'll talk about that iteration. Also, we'll see sort of iterations of this house. Sometimes it has a porch, a front porch, sometimes it doesn't. The Croydon collection, this is the Browncroft neighborhood, so a lot of his designs in Browncroft were often just sort of one-off, for this developer or that client. The majority of the ones that he has in Browncroft are through that sort of path, just sort of individual commissions. But on Croydon Road, he works with a single developer and does 8 houses at once. Each house is different in its own way, in different styles and different cladding materials. In ways, you'll see this sort of again with these collections, like he's almost sort of flexing his design muscles. It's like, hey, look at me, I can combat all these different little uniquely styled houses, and they're all being next to each other in this wonderful little composition that I created, and you get to have benefit living in it. So here is the one side of Croydon, sort of in order, marching down, north to south. So it is sort of simple Corner Revival, has a wonderful little decorative flower box there. Then this sort of stucco clad one with this bow sort of bay window, really great big decorative window on the front. This sort of Tudor Revival, it's got a great little triangular window, probably looking into a closet. And then I've never really been able to figure out what I want to call this house. We actually use, this is probably, and I'm not going to sort of show a series of this, might actually be the most frequent design of his that he just keeps churning over. You see it everywhere throughout. So there's probably at least 10 versions of this house. But it always has a sort of distinctive pediment, a little projected bay that's always the sort of sunroom. Often has a very broad open, in this case this is one large window, and then you have the big bay window at the living room, and then sort of slope through. Sometimes you'll put a flower box on top of it. And then often, which we haven't seen yet, you'll see a lot if they're still intact, the use of these actual functional but very decoratively designed trellises for climbing vine and climbing plants. Again, trying to tie the house to the landscape. And in this case, being sort of more legitimate about it, whereas on those entrances, they're more like a privacy screen. But these ones that are right against the wall are certainly more functional. Here's the other side of the street. Again, going sort of north to south. You can see this is a little similar to the previous house we saw, but not quite. But it still has a bit of that sort of compositional language to it. And now to the biggest and fanciest of these collections. So I call it the Council Rock Quintet. So McCord partners with a local developer, Maurice Joyce, who's primarily doing a lot of sort of higher-end homes in and throughout the Houston Barker tracks. That's like Grover, Pelham, Council Rock, off of East Avenue. And he, McCord does 6 homes for Joyce. 5 are all done as a set, is what we're looking at. And then he does a final one for Joyce up on Pelham Road, which is really big. We'll see that at the end, as I say, mansions to the left. Because he did do some really big houses, but we're not going to look at them quite yet. So this is the first one. Really great, sort of rambling Tudor Revival, a lot of the same similar elements we're seeing. Something I will point out is some of his higher style examples, essentially when he could sort of afford it, he would do these sort of decorative, tiny little stained glass maquettes. Often they weren't much bigger than a single pane, or maybe a little bigger than a break outside of the regular rectangle. It would never be a full panel a stainless. It's always a little decorative, almost like emblem. Another little decorative window here. It's hard to see, but there are turnings here in between each window. And then it's totally obscured by this bush, but trust me, the windows looking into the garage here, which is facing the side so you don't see the doors, they have a series of those turnings sort of screening the doors from the front. This is the next one down the line. Some good friends of mine work here today. I have this wonderful house. This is maybe a little atypical, honestly, for McCord's design work, but certainly plays into some of those the more strictly classical designs and proportions that you're seeing earlier in his career, more of a civic work. But this is a really wonderful home that has a lot of great McCord detail inside and out. It's been sort of really wonderfully preserved, and it has cream plumbing, jet black cream plumbing in the powder room. But one of my favorite moments in this house, and if you got to do, let's see, the 2020 Member Society Home Garden for the virtual one, this house was on the tour, and one of my favorite moments in the house is McCord's interest in creating these symmetrical compositions both inside and out. And when you sort of come in here, so it's very, symmetrically arranged lanterns here with these sort of decorative flourishes. Oops. When you come in, the stair hall is wider than what you see here. So when you proceed up the stairs and you arrive at this window, there's actually a third panel that's a mirror, so you don't see the window on the outside, but by doing the third panel, it centers the window opening on the stair flare on the inside. So he's playing this game of changing the sort of axes inside and out so he can compose and balance both the exterior and the interior space on the house. Just down the road, Maurice Joyce lived in this house briefly. He sort of lived almost in, not quite every house, but a lot of the houses here in the five. He sort of jumped one to the other as he sold them. But still, and then sort of read some historic photos, it's a little hard to see because of the tree cover. But again, it's very similar to the balanced proportions. There is this sort of three-tiered chimney, oddly, even though it's not a Tudor Revival. And then these sort of more highly articulated entryways with these decorative geometric flourishes and the decorative wrought iron there. A little more straightforward Twenties Revival, but still sort of part of the whole set. And then he terminates with another Tudor Revival at the end. Again, it has a lot of that same similar language we're used to seeing. These really big, giant turned spindles as columns, and graduated fenestration on the symmetrical gable, these little encaged brackets, the large timber brackets beneath, and then that sort of decorative big window there on the right. Okay. So I think I have 4 or 5 iterative designs to go through. I won't talk too much about them, but it's just sort of fun to sort of see little visual changes, and then I can add something I can take away. This one's a brick, that one's not. But I think that sort of helped him as far as the volume of work he put out. He wasn't, doing 200 individual designs as a sole practitioner in 10 to 15 years. He had a couple that he would sort of modify or revisit from time to time. So this cottage is sort of called Cottage Number One. This version as well as the next version you'll see are both done in the 19th Ward neighborhood. And you can sort of again see a lot of the similar details that we're used to seeing. The sort of decorative windows. We also have that interesting little geometric decorative trellis there on the side entryway. A atypical porch on a Tudor right on the front. Now this one, see the one a little bit bigger. This is a good friend of mine's house. They eliminated the porch because they wanted a music room. Wonderful sun-filled music room that you enter into. Because the stair floor is actually in the middle of this house. That's why there was that very prominent middle entry in that first version. Can't see there because of how the photograph shot. But by infilling that porch, you sort of gains the space. You can still see the overall composition and the shape of the house is the same. And then a little harder to grasp. I only picked up on this reason. It's almost like you take this, and well, we need a bigger house. We really like how this form feels. So what if we take that and then add a side wing to it with the porch off to the side? Okay, Cottage Number Two. This one's fun. Some, like the other one, some have porches, some don't. But you can still see the same base composition that gets sort of revisited time and time again. And occasionally, usually the ones with the front porch don't get the sunroom to the side, so the porch will just sort of come off of the living room. This is right down the road from my parents' house, I think. The owner is here. Oh, excellent. But again, a lot of similar design language we're used to seeing. But here's a Tudor Revival version of the same, up in the kind of a rounded way. This one's got 2 dormers instead of 1, but still very similar. Then we get a little more formal and fancy. This one might look very familiar, but this is sort of another version of it. So that was that sort of very first Tudor I showed you in the Brown neighborhood. This is sort of another clone of it that was built later, and it's a little more simplified than that. And I have 2 really sort of point ramblers, so they're a little bit more exuberant in their massing, and are sort of these interesting asymmetrical compositions. So I showed this one before. Here's a version of it with an octagonal sunroom, and then a more Tudor Revival entry and detailing. And then that same form as the Tudor Revival, same octagonal sunroom, now really nicely done Tudor Revival hundreds, and we wanted a little bit bigger bedroom maybe, or a breakfast nook off the kitchen, so now we have this interesting little side gable punched off the side. Wrangler number 2. So we've already seen this was on Seneca Parkway. So keep that image in your head. There's the brick that's mirrored. And certainly, it doesn't have the, really strong Tudor Revival detail that we saw in the previous one. This one's a little more pared back, maybe a little more modern feeling. I've always loved this house. It's a really great paint job as well. I just think it really pops with its high contrast stucco and more sort of buff reddish. And then there is again, just a few blocks away from that brick one. And then I've got 2 that are sort of advanced, like they're trying to yearn to be one of the big fancy houses, and they're not quite there. This one has 4 iterations of it. I've been in 3 of the 4. And each one has a different rear wing. So this is one that's really, it's like the front facade is the key, but then it really changes on the back. So honestly, they're kind of different houses, but they're sort of more elaborate iterations on the base design. There's a little more formal Tudor version of it. Chimney's in the same spot. We've lost the porch that was on the previous one, and then because of that, the roof's been lower, so we don't get that sort of little decorative dormer at the second floor. The same, we have the side gable there, entries there, there's the chimney, living room continues over to the sunroom. You see it? There's the next one. Little brick version. Really love these sort of little geometric, almost abstracted Corinthian capitals. And again, very same composition. A lot of those signature details we're used to seeing at 3-tiered chimney. Here we have these engaged brackets, but not in timber, but in stone. And then we also have little teeny brackets on that dormer. And then the fanciest of them all, the sort of final of the 4. But again, see the same massing. This one has the porch, but it doesn't have a big cap slide roof, so we don't get a dormer at the second floor. We get more sort of normal windows at the second floor. But again, similar compositions. This has a really great sort of panel window arrangement here with these decorative carved shield insignias. This is another one, and I think this is the last iterative design we showed. So there are more. I just didn't want to show you everything because it's too much. So this is what I call Man's number 2. This one's really fun because some of the iterations in a sort of response to the site or to the program for the house, he actually kinks the plans. This house is flat, right? You're going to see a couple of them. That sort of living room wing here turns at a 30-degree angle, and then you end up getting like a rear wing off of this, almost creates like a Y shape in the plan. So we'll see a couple different versions of that. So this is the one that's got that kink. This is in the Brown neighborhood. And it's got oddly a sort of sunroom, so it's sort of like off the rear corner of the living room instead of sort of being directly adjacent to it. There's another version of it. This is like the fanciest version of one, but same sort of kink. And then this one's great because it's on a corner lot, so you can really see that rear wing extending back, creating the leg of the Y. This has also got a lot of the great sort of common recorded language with these brackets, the decorative trellis, describing a chimney here. There's also these flourishes of carved grape leaves, which are, this photo might cost my grade C, but I promise we were there. Okay, and now the final, all been waiting for. So obviously, because he was so well covered, he he was in these sort of social circles, he's got wealthy friends, he's being well regarded for his residential design. It's not surprising that he ends up designing a number of very large prominent homes. He's come near the tail end of that sort of 10 to 15 year period, I think, so he's sort of building up to this. Then suddenly he gets a whole slew of these really large homes, essentially from 1928 to 1931. He doesn't really get any really big homes earlier in the 20s. It's all sort of bred determinist, running into the Great Depression. He has a bunch of these really large houses. This is a great sort of full-page ad that's done about Ambassador and Sandringham roads. They use Barber Track. There are a number of prominent architects that design houses throughout this neighborhood. McCord might have the largest number of houses in the neighborhood. The ones that are done by McCord, we just saw a photo of this one there, and then there's another one here in Dutch Colonial. Ward Wellington Ward is the name I recognize. He did a number of homes in the neighborhood. Bohack Brew, Edgar Phillips, the designer of the local theater, did a number of houses in the neighborhood. But McCord's got 6 or 7 to his name on these 2 streets alone. So this is the earliest one. Really big, prominent Dutch Colonial, but using that same sort of palette of the sort of wonderfully mixed, probably fieldstone, very highly detailed entryway with like a lot of his sort of colonial revival or Dutch colonial revival designs. This is sort of the only one outside of strictly Ambassador Sandringham. So this is the final house he does for Maurice Choice, the developer that did the Council Rock Quintet. This is up on Pelham Road. The use of stone is a little atypical, this sort of gray, but you do get a lot of sort of similar. He does this house because of this heavy growth, you're not able to see it. But a number of the windows have those sort of decorative stained glass details. Look at the interior shot of one of these houses so you get a better understanding of what those look like. But still, even on the front, you can throw in a little decorative window. There's the itty bitty little turnings and break up those panels to these windows. And then we also have, though in masonry, those engaged brackets made out of stone instead of timber. Reed Residence is certainly far more formal. I particularly love the entryway because it has these sort of more highly detailed, more Art Nouveau carvings like we've seen in really earlier, more classical work. It's interesting to sort of see it re-emerge here on a Tudor. And I really love that he sort of takes this and he scales it down, does it on the front door, and then still divides the little lead-to-lead slice of little towns. The Utz residence, the original client inherited a large fortune from his father, who built a massive sort of shoe manufacturing industry. So this is the house that women's shoes built. It was strictly women's shoes. They only lived here for about 3 or 4 years and then sold it to much longer term owners. But this has a lot of sort of playful detail to it, these sort of little wavy half timbering, photo aging, and tool marks. Again, the same sort of mixed fieldstone, these decorative wrought iron flourishes, heavy wood turnings used as columns porch, this really wonderful little decorative portal window. Get a close up there with the little decorative wrought iron overlays on it. Love that mailbox. And then very sort of private style liquid door with just a little sort of little speakeasy grill. And this is sort of the one that started this little session. The Barnes residence is built in 1931. A number of these photos are much earlier because the current owners have erected a very large hedge. You can't see it, but the previous owners had allowed me to sort of opportunity to come through, comb through the house, look at the drawings. So this one is the one you're going to see some interior photographs of. It's advancing on my computer, I promise. Press it again.
Well, and you could put two cars.
He hasn't pointed any house.
You're also beautiful out. Just sort of yellow.
It just struck you today and you wanted to go. I saw the poster.
Well, it happens pretty, and I know where, I know where it's
So when we took that, somewhere up in Maple, we probably saw one or two
You told me you got it yesterday.
up.
So I just.
well, I think, because I'm coming up, maybe by the 6th.
I'm sure Ward Wellington Ward was a friend.
I don't think he's sometimes going to go like 5 minutes.
That's
what I was thinking.
Yeah, the roof was flat over on the porch.
Hopefully this works. All right, so only a few more houses left. Sorry to bore you to death with so many beautiful homes. Okay, so with the Burns residence, Klein was a very prominent lawyer at the time in Rochester. We went over a couple of details there on the front that are sort of common from court work, but obviously it's a little more elaborate. And certainly in this house, he sort of really gets to play into a lot of his sort of most favorite items to utilize various handcraft throughout the house, both the woodwork as well as the stained glass. As a quick look at the back side, but still sort of more of the same. There we go. Oh, it's gone. Just give it a second. No, you're right. Okay. So this really wonderful little Juliet balcony that has these sort of turned columns. The living room sort of opens up with these sort of French doors, and a lot of glasses, and there's a little stained glass above it coming out. Again, have those use of the little engaged brackets, and then with these more high style ones where we have this sort of hand tooling, a little more elaborate decorative flourishes on the exterior. And also, this house has got some good original garage doors too. A lot of the garage doors actually used small turnings to break up all the glass along the top, just like his front doors would. I've only seen a handful of his original garage doors still intact. Because obviously those tend to go by the wayside because everyone wants overhead doors. Okay, so take a second. Okay. The photo looks great. It's running on the screen. What if I did two computers? Drink it up. Okay. So the notion I talked about where he uses symmetrical composition on the exterior, even as an asymmetrical house, you see that as he compartmentalizes into rooms. A lot of his rooms are often very symmetrically arranged with very strong visual axes through them. You can see that here, sort of going both directions with really wonderful expansive glass French doors centered on the hearth, the fireplace. And then the glass bay beyond, looking out at the side yard with these wonderful little sort of small stained glass little maquettes sort of thrown into expanding the panels, and those sort of interspersed throughout. And then, like I said, the more elaborate ones, he really starts to utilize sort of handicrafts. We have this sort of traditional linen, what's called linen fold carving on the wood panels, meant to sort of give the impression of crumpled cloth, but in wood. And it uses some of these intimate spaces where he's playing with the scale, even if it's all larger. So this is right to the side of the fireplace in that previous room. And that's their little reading nook. These wonderful little stained glass grapevines at the top. And then the sort of beautiful little built-ins with their little decorative flourishes. And then here from the dining room looking into the kitchen, we have this sort of beautiful breakfast nook with coordinated bucket pantry separating these sort of two larger spaces from one another. And again, with these sort of little playful, whimsical flourishes even on the built-ins. Okay. This is maybe the latest one built in the neighborhood. One of the smaller ones, and is only one of two examples I've come across where he takes that interest in the use of the octagonal form that he's only kind of just using on sunrooms only, and also turns into this sort of tower-like form on the front of the house. And this house is sort of fully clad in stone with a sort of large slater. This is part of a full-page advertisement in the Democrat Chronicle that the buyers of the home took out to thank McCord and all the contractors that have worked on the house for doing such a sort of like going above and beyond on designing their house. There's the large interchange. This is probably a little typical, although I've seen a few of these mid-30s McCord houses. I haven't seen enough to really understand how his language is changing. You can certainly see this doesn't quite look like anything else we've been seeing. We're not seeing those sort of more whimsical flourishes of those brackets or the decorative windows. It does still have the same sort of balanced, classically sort of based proportions. We used to allow the graduated chimneys. We saw better in the historic photograph. But certainly, in a way, it's becoming a little less whimsical than some of his 20s work. That does seem to be the case with his 1930s residences, but I've only sort of seen 2 or 3 of them. The documentation really drops off when you get to the Great Depression as far as his work being sort of noted in newspapers. And then the biggest house that he built, he designed one larger, but get built. This is the Lee residence. This is an expansive, rambling house. It includes a freestanding garage or carriage house that the client brought McCord back to design in 1941. And it looks just like the main house, even though it's separated by 10 or 11 years. We have that octagon tower form that we saw on the Schlegel house. But, you know, this has got a lot of the great details that we're used to seeing, though it's a little dark to sort of see that we have these sort of wood turnings between the windows. There's another little decorative Juliet balcony. There's sort of gauge stone brackets here on that side facade, the graduated chimney. And, you know, this is likely one of those sort of readings off the living room again, like we saw with Burns residence. But I can't confirm for sure. I've only ever seen the stair hall and the solarium in this house, which line up on an axis from the door you walk in. It's the most exquisite stair hall I've ever seen is in this house, and then it leads you right out into this stone floored solarium, looking out over the rear yard, which is walls of diamond pane stained glass. And then here is the largest house ever designed, but it did not get built. So this was designed for Fred Tobin, the owner of Tobin Franks, Tobin Meatpacking. But Mr. Tobin did not end up going through with the design, but the design was fully developed to the point they hired, this is not McCord, this is the plaster sculptor that they hired to make a full-scale model of all the detail of McCord's design, because McCord and the noted landscape architect Alan DeForest were collaborating together to design the whole estate. So DeForest had a whole design for the estate grounds, and McCord had a very elaborate house design. This would have been at the corner of Sandringham and Esplanade Drive. There's a very large, newer traditional house there that not sat vacant for decades, but this would have sort of sat there and would have likely rivaled or been larger than Frank Dad's mansion, which is the largest house in that neighborhood. So I'll end with this. So I kind of mentioned it, so when I started my interest in McCord, really there was not a lot known about him. There were maybe 3 or 4 houses to his name. Where he's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery, he's just on a shared family stone that just says Leander Jr. There's no mention, no epitaph talking about his sort of legacy, his contributions, his design work, his passion. But recently sort of came across there was a in memoriam that was published a year after his death by his siblings, and it's transcribed here. So when we make it early dawn, we know and knew that you were gone, and even when dark creeps around the door, it is then we miss you more. The work you do out here dearly stands as monuments to your memory. Now, abiding faith, we wait till you greet us at the heavenly gate, brothers and sisters. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. So, sorry that we're a little late, but I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any, but don't feel bad, I'll leave it. I have my business card. I didn't bring enough for everybody, but I can certainly put a few up here. Okay. Another question?
So we have one of these boarding houses that you showed.
Yeah.
And when we were new to the neighborhood, we were told that you could tell different architects by the designs built into the shutters. Is that because you would assume then that all of those 6 houses that you showed would have the same kind of design?
Yeah.
But they don't. So
Right.
is that a folklore or?
I think that's the sort of like local folklore. So it's possible that some of those bedroom shutters would have actually been custom hand built to the architect specifications. I have seen some McCord drawings where he really gets to that level of detail, like even for porch columns, he draws the profile of exactly what he wants for the base, exactly what he wants for the capital. But with a lot of those houses where they're sort of more geared for the middle class, predominantly those are going to be parts that are coming out of a catalog or from some larger manufacturer. McCord would have likely had a couple favorites that he would have frequented, maybe used a lot in his design, but he wouldn't necessarily have just stuck to a single design. But you definitely do see a lot of use of decorative shutters on his houses. But they come in all sort of forms and sizes. We saw a couple of Tudors where they're sort of like these rough boards that just have a board holding them together. But there's also ones that have the more decorative geometric cutouts on them as well. So of course, only folklore. Some of the architects in that area do have a sort of distinctive language like McCord did for his homes. So he's not necessarily the only one that developed language. If you start seeing multiple houses, you'll start recognizing them. One of his contemporary C-stores, Barrows, who's a lot of houses in the Coppsville neighborhood. Barrows is another one that has this really distinctive residential design language. Once you see a handful of them, you just start seeing them again and again and again. You know exactly if that's a Barrows design house. But unfortunately, not as easy as Barrows. But thanks for the question.
I have one comment and one question. I think you should do a book. I think with all of everything you've done here, you could easily self-publish a book. It'd be great, and I think everyone in the room would buy 2 copies. Do you know if Leander McCord was a frenemy with Ward Wellington Ward and/or with Fletcher Steele?
I wonder, yeah, because they were working in the same neighborhoods, and certainly it would seem like as far as like fancy Tudor Revival designs are concerned, it's like when you start looking at the collection, it's like it's either a McCord or it's a Ward Wellington Ward, and then some of the architects do also do some real the architect for the Little Theater, Ian Phillips, is really wonderful, whimsical designs, but he's got like maybe 10 houses at most. But yeah, I'd be curious. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised because they were certainly competing for clients against one another, and especially with Ward Wellington Ward being sort of out of town hotshot from Syracuse. That I could see potential competition. Certainly by the late 20s, McCord didn't have that competition anymore. If anyone's familiar with Ward Wellington Ward, he tragically suffered a severe brain injury in an argument supposedly with a contractor, where the contractor hit him in the head with a blunt instrument. And Ward Wellington Ward was hospitalized from about the mid-1920s until he died in the early 1930s. And his career was abruptly cut short in the mid-1920s. Certainly in the early 20s, they might have been competing, but a lot of the Ward's most distinctive residences in our area are usually like 1920 to 23. But they certainly would have overlapped with their.
Yes, my daughter owns the house in Arundecoit that you showed.
Yes.
And there are screens to go on the front porch.
Yep.
Would that have been original? Would he have designed that, or would you guess that would be something someone else later?
So, I know, like with my parents' house, they have the front porch. Front porch never had screens on, but they also have a sleeping porch.
Yes.
It goes off of a bedroom.
Yep.
And that does have sort of built-in screens and storms that would change seasonally.
Okay.
And there's not really any indication that those were added after the fact. They do, when you look at the details of how everything comes together, they feel very designed and sort of intentional. So it's likely they were.
Okay.
And that would have been, especially for sleeping porches, that would have been very common. Because the sleeping porch was supposed to be, you're getting fresh air, but you're also sleeping out there in the sort of cold air, or even the warm air. You don't want to be, eaten alive by mosquitoes and bugs. So you would have had those sort of seasonal enclosures, at least for the sleeping porches. A lot of his front porches were often open. I have seen a few that have some sort of enclosure, but I'm not certain if that's original or not.
Okay. And can I ask one more?
Yeah.
On the sleeping porch, at one point, the previous owner removed one window to make a closet.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have the window. Is there any place you know of where leaded glass windows are still manufactured?
So we have 3 or 4 local people that do leaded glass. So the most qualified person, and she primarily does church windows, so she may be your point of last resort if the other people that are primarily residential work can't do it.
Okay.
And that's Valerie O'Hara, Pike Stained Glass Studios, a family stained glass company that's been in Rochester for 130, 140 years now.
Okay.
Valerie's 3rd or 4th generation of the family. Valerie's fantastic. She's a friend of our firm, but again, I'm going to emphasize primarily since she's like really, really high-end art of stained glass, and she is mostly doing church windows.
Okay.
And then then for smaller scale people that are doing, both church as well as residential, there's, Godfrey Mueller. There is, a company called Unified Vision Studios. The person who runs that's called Matt Smith. And then, fourth person I'm forgetting, but I know they're near to retirement, because they're like 92. So, I'll hold off on any names that's escaping me, but those three, but certainly the last two, Jeff Mueller or Matt Smith, would be able to do that. Matt Smith's actually quite young, so he's maybe sort of the future of residential stained glass in our area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
June 4th.
anyone else?
Wow.
Nice call.
How do people watch those diamond shaped windows?
If you were to ask someone like Matt Smith around our era, the way that they would traditionally do it, so if you're just doing intermittent washing, when you're just using it's not acidic pour basis, really just kind of very mildly soapy water, you don't want to let it sit, you don't want it to soak down into those leaded panes. But you can also use what's called whiting, which they use to make the cement that holds the panes in the lead. But whiting is also used for just cleaning glass after they've assembled the panel, but it can also just be used to clean glass. So I would just say very mild soapy water, nothing more. You don't want to soak it. You probably really want to use like a wet, rag or paper towel to keep the moisture down. If you don't want it to soak down in, because that will end up deteriorating that sort of cement quicker.
Black paint.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.